how do you find the inspiration for the projects that you get into? Because there are somewhat varied. Your chaplains, you've got black soldiers, you've got even back to the films that you did, with the teenage type movies. How do you find the inspiration for the various things that you get involved in?
It's a good question. And I think over my career, my movies have gone through different phases. So like I'm inspired by different things at different times in my life. And a lot of times those connect to things I was going through in my life. So when I was in my 20s, I was like, teenage movies, that's what I want. And like girls, I'm into it.
Yep.
And then, I kind of found myself growing up and I made some romantic comedies. And then for a while, I was kind of the sequel guy and made some sequels to like Daddy Daycare and some of those types of movies. And like, there's different stuff. And so what's interesting for me is that I'm probably atypical in terms of that inspiration, because there are people that I know and I have an incredible respect for, and maybe they're more creative than I am, but they truly like wake up with an inspiration. They have this idea and they can't put it away until they get it made as a movie or TV show. And I've never been that way. I've always been somebody that somebody brings me something and I spark to it, as opposed to me saying, oh, I'm inspired by this idea, I'm going to go and like proactively do it. Right. And so I become proactive, but I start by being reactive. Like, and this Combat Chaplains thing is a perfect example. Like
It is.
Mike Sullivan at Paulus Productions, he had that idea. And he came to me and he's like, well, you've got some credibility with the Army and it seems like they probably would trust you and they're not paying attention to me. And I need that Department of Defense contract if I'm going to make this movie. Can you get involved? And I was like, oh, sure. That's pretty interesting. Tell me about the story. And the more I got into it, then obviously I went from being reactive to proactive. And that's ultimately what inspired me, because I kind of had to do my own research to get into it. Like I wasn't just inspired with this little nugget of an idea. And I think that's actually been very consistent throughout my career. And I think it's if you're not wired to be that person, which I'm not, to be like, oh, I've got this great idea, I've got to make it, then you also have to be willing to say yes when the universe, puts opportunities in front of you.
Yeah.
And I think some people forget that. They feel like, oh, I'm just waiting for that one perfect project. Like I've made a bunch of shitty projects, perfect projects for me, just by leaning into them and really finding inspiration in, an opportunity that presented itself to me. It's like the old story about like guys in his house, big flood comes, crawls up to the roof, a helicopter comes by. He's like, no, God will save me. And boat comes by. No, God will save me. Canoe comes by. He's like, no, God will save me. Guy dies, goes up to heaven. God's like, dude, I sent you a canoe. I sent you a boat.
Yeah.
You weren't
What
open
else
to
did
it,
you
man.
want?
So I kind of feel like that's who I am. I'm inspired by other people. And then I kind of take it. I've always been the guy that like knows how to do, kind of take somebody that's got a spark who doesn't quite know what to do with it. I'm like, oh, I can help you. I know how to do that. Right. And that's
me
what
and Nick
gets
are
me
exactly
inspired.
like that. We're like that so to the core. It's crazy. You use the term lean in. That's exactly what we do. We love to collaborate. And when someone says something, Nick did it a few times. I think we both did it a few times, even in this conversation. You say a thing and it's like, how about this? Yes, and how about this? What if you did this? What if there was a hashtag for this? Or what if you tried this approach? And that's just that leaning in where someone inspires you. The collaboration in film is unlike collaboration in any other art form. And you fall in love with that. You want that. You run towards that. And even if you're not the one that came up with the idea, you're leaning in and you're, like you said, sparked by it. I can completely relate with that.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'll end. I don't have any other questions, but I have this comment for Rich. You must wake up and go to sleep every day with a heart filled with gratitude, because all of these ideas are like little gifts left at your doorstep. And then you're able to take those gifts that people give you, these ideas, these passions, make them your own, and then create these wonderful things out of them. every time you look back at a project, you must think, wow, what a gift that someone has brought to me and brought into my life. It's such an amazing thing.
Yep.
Well, don't get me wrong, man. Like, I still quit like 3 times a week, but it's down from 7.
So, good job.
You know,
well done.
And I think you got to you got to find the inspiration somewhere, right? So if you're not the guy that naturally, wakes up with that light bulb moment, like, then be open to it. Like I mentioned earlier, I was one of the founders of the VIX streaming service, and so when I started that thing, it was there's 2 stories. There's a public story.
Can we contextualize that for the audience, Rich? I'm sorry. This is the largest Spanish-speaking streaming service in the world, right?
Yes.
At the time, for sure. So go ahead. I just want to make sure the audience knew this is a large streaming service with lots of eyeballs.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, to put it in perspective, it's now owned by Televisa Univision. We sold it to them a few years ago. VIX has got about 75,000 hours of content, which is a lot.
Yeah.
It's, at least last time I looked, it was the most used Spanish language app of any kind in the U.S. We often beat Netflix for being the most used entertainment service in many countries in Latin America on any given day.
Wow.
We were Apple's TV App of the Year, which is the first time a Spanish language app has ever won the top global honor. At Apple, we produce about 7,000 hours of original scripted content per year. So, pretty big scale to that.
Remarkable.
It started with, ultimately, it went through, it's like anything else. It went through a long journey of stuff. And originally, the streaming service that I started was called Pongalo, which in Spanish means like play it, like put in the tape and play it. It's kind of what it means. And then I acquired a bunch of 7 different companies over the course of 3 or 4 years, merged it with a company called VIX that was a big social media player that had 100 million Spanish-speaking eyeballs on Facebook. We built that up even further, sold it to Univision. Once it's been in the Univision machine, it's gotten even bigger. And each time I was taking on more partners and really sort of turning it into something. We then combined it with some other streaming services that we bought at Televisa Univision, one called Pantalla that we bought from Lionsgate, one called Prende, one called Blem that was in Mexico. I mean, so it's got a long origin story, but ultimately it started because I had invested in a company that owned a bunch of Mexican movies. And after a very inappropriately short amount of time, the whole thing basically blew up. And because of the way I had invested in this, I wound up owning 300 Mexican movies. And I'm like, what the hell am I going to do with these? And I stuck them on YouTube and people came out of the woodwork. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Maybe there's some pent up demand here, and maybe Spanish speakers are underserved and they're not getting these movies that were originally produced in Spanish. And sure enough, the more I kind of leaned into that, I was like, oh, well, all they're getting are Disney movies dubbed into Spanish. And that's not super culturally authentic. And so it ultimately led me to do more and more stuff. Now, like the public version is like, oh, I grew up in Texas and Hispanic media has been a part of my world. And, I was a visionary and I saw a very clear lane and that kind of stuff. But the reality of it is it was just like a failed investment. And, for a guy that doesn't speak Spanish, I'm like, what am I going to do with these things? And then I realized, oh, well, there's other companies out there like this one that had blown up. And these guys own 300 Mexican movies and those guys own 400 and those guys own 600. And pretty soon I looked up and I had 1,800 Mexican movies. And then I was like, well, what am I going to do with these? And, you just keep steamrolling. And I think that's the way, at least movies for me have really worked, is just to, find the inspiration somewhere and then lean into it. So yeah, Nick, I think you said it really well.